IT. Can everyone see my screen okay here? Thumbs up. All right. Start my timer. All right. So hello everyone, and thanks so much for attending my talk today. As mentioned, my name is Colin, and thank you, Eloisa, for the wonderful introduction. I'm not going to spend any more time introducing myself here because I do have a lot to get through, and you'll get to know me a bit better over the course of this talk anyways. So the detailed title of today's talk is Beyond Good Intentions, Reflections on Meaningful Engagement in Allyship in Research with Six Nations of the Grand River. But today's talk is not just a talk, it's also a journey. So please join me as we embark on an adventure on the water together. So ahoy there, folks. I'll be your captain today. And as first order of business, we will need to make some initial preparations. So please allow me to set the waterscape. Welcome aboard, everyone. Where are we? Well, we're aboard the SS Wilson, of course. And it's not much, but it's a vessel that's been in the work for years. Now, today we'll be setting our Wilson sails on a personal experience of reflection from my time working in the Haudenosaunee community of Six Nations of the Grand River. And just a little note of who is with us today. We have on board a diverse group of mostly fellow non-Indigenous settlers, mainly those who are engaged in researching the natural world. So I've intentionally directed any insights derived from my reflections towards you. That being said, come one, come all are welcome aboard the SS Wilson. So if there are any friends here of Haudenosaunee heritage, thank you for sharing and letting us navigate your waters today. And this leads to our next order of business. In order to set sail, we must first gather our bearings and map out our route. This includes recognizing both the land that we were on, and the stewards of that land. So starting off with place. As I hinted, our trip today will have us heading into Six Nations territory, which is located here in southwestern Ontario, and we'll be departing off the nearby banks of the Grand River. Now, as we venture up the Grand, we'll be traveling along a reach of the river that flows into the contemporary reserve boundaries of Six Nations, indicated by the red. And to those of you visiting the region for the first time, the Grand River is a major waterway that flows into the Great Lake of Erie, indicated here as we zoom out a little bit on our map. So now I mentioned earlier that traveling into Six Nations means that we're in Haudenosaunee territory. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So who are the Haudenosaunee people? Well, Haudenosaunee translates in the language to people of the Longhouse. And the term longhouse is both a reference to traditional dwellings as well as the metaphorical longhouse that is made up of the six Indigenous nations that comprise the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. These nations include Mohawk, Ohnegahdę, Ohnegahdę, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. Now, there's much more to learn about Haudenosaunee culture in Six Nations in order to be respectful, especially if you're interested in forming a research partnership. But we don't have much time here, so that'll have to be homework for our guests aboard the SS Wilson if they're interested in learning more. But as a final note of acknowledgement, the reason why it is so important to recognize and understand both place and people is because as settlers and guests to this land, we have historical treaty obligations that must be upheld. For example, what you're seeing here is called the Kuswantha, or the Two-Row Wampum. And it was created in the 17th century to document an agreement between the Haudenosaunee people of Turtle Island and the settlers that were new to the territory. There's much to know about the Kuswantha, but its basic symbology represents the distinct identity of two people with a mutual understanding of coexistence and peace, one in Indigenous canoe and the other on a settler sailboat. And as such, this treaty not only recognizes Haudenosaunee sovereignty, but also helps provide insight on allyship and the treaty obligations of settlers. That is, those of us in the sailboat, which we'll be continuing to travel on for the duration of this talk. So please keep this in mind today, but also moving forward as you embark on your own research adventures. This is because, while the Two-Row Wampum is an example of treaty obligations towards the Haudenosaunee in this region of Canada, there are many, many treaties across Turtle Island and around the world. And for more information on this, I encourage you to check out a website called nativeland.ca. All right, folks, so we're just about ready to depart, but before we launch, we have two final topics to go over. And these are housekeeping rules and a brief captain's caveat. So today, housekeeping rules refers to the organization and order of our journey. In short, I'll be presenting my reflections in chronological order as I experience them. And to help further organize my reflections, I've categorized them into lessons, concepts, and tools, which will periodically pop up a page that looks like this as we cruise through our tour. And don't worry about taking any notes. Once we get back to the dock, we'll do a final review. And now for the caveats. To avoid overgeneralizing today's reflection, I want to note the rule of thumb that you should always contextualize your practices and follow local community protocols. Water bodies do, of course, vary across regions, as do the people in the communities that steward them. Secondly, the experiences and opinions expressed here today are not necessarily the views of the institutions and research groups I'm affiliated with, and I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of Six Nations. And finally, while I feel like I've learned a lot since starting my own journey and that I do have insights to offer, I recognize that I'm still very much on a pathway of learning. So please do take what resonates with you and perhaps other reflections with a grain of salt. Your training and experience may end up differing greatly from mine. All right, now that we're fully prepared, onward we can go. So to begin, I want to mention that I've been working on research-related work with Six Nations for about 4 years now. So although I would consider myself a junior captain, I was very much a landlubber with no familiarity of these waters not too long ago. We're going to start there and then progress through what I consider notable stages of personal and professional growth, which can be seen here as stepping stones of increasing in size. So where did my grad school begin? Well, in an effort to broaden my environmental engineering horizons, I decided to enroll in the Collaborative Engineering and International Development graduate program at the University of Guelph. From there, my research interests directed towards water challenges in Indigenous communities, in large part because of the 2015 releases of the Sustainable Development Goals and the final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I would say that this research area was both a result of my interests and a product of the discourse emerging in social and environmental justice circles at the time. So simply put, with my research area identified, I was ready to get started. Although unique, my graduate program actually began quite similarly to most others. I took courses, read literature, and prepared for my qualifying exams. Now, as part of this process, I prepared something called a comprehensive document or research proposal for my committee. Based on gaps in literature, I proposed a research idea, pretty standard. And at the time, I felt I was at least academically quite familiar with common water issues in Indigenous communities across Canada. So what I had come up with was an idea to see if international development project management tools would be relevant in the cross-cultural context of Indigenous water management projects. Sounds great, right? So now that I was fully equipped with the best of intentions, I was ready to pound the pavement. Or was I? At this point, my research came to a halt. I mean, looking back, a little embarrassing, but where was the engagement? So the next stage of my research journey is what I call the need for engagement period. And this stage began with two very basic and simple questions. Has any Indigenous community expressed interest in this research? And who is benefiting? Well, the short answers are no and me. And just like that, this humbling experience would ultimately end up altering the trajectory of my research for years to come, and rightfully so. Alas, we come to our first stop on our tour together to feature a reflection that provides us with both a key concept and an important tool. The concept I want to briefly touch on here is positionality, because I think understanding this idea can help prevent researchers from inadvertently undertaking such a research approach that is principally beneficial for themselves. One definition of positionality describes the idea as how an author's racial, gender, class, or other self-identifications, experiences, and privileges influence research. To establish your positionality, you have to be honest with yourself and perhaps even go on a journey of self-discovery. What about me makes me want to engage in this particular research? For me, this was honestly not something I had really thought of all that much before, but being exposed to the concept helped me more deeply reflect on why I was interested in doing the research that I was. And on top of good intentions, how I could operationalize engagement to allow for a community to start leading the process. And in terms of a tool for this, beyond simply reflecting on everything in your head, writing positionality statements for your research endeavors can help remind you of what your position is to research, what your biases are, and how to combat them. Now, around this time, I was also learning a lot about research ethics. And what I had come to learn about Indigenous research ethics is that it includes both ethics of working with human participants, especially for communities with socioeconomic inequalities, but also that it referred to Indigenous ethics. Now, to avoid being overly reductionist, I only want to touch on this briefly, but I want to do so by sharing a question that I was asked during my qualifying exam that completely stumped me. Who are the stakeholders in my research? And as I went through the list of collaborators and partners and who my research might be relevant to, I could tell I was starting to reach a little bit, but I was still missing the mark. So finally, I ended up being bailed out. The major stakeholder that I was missing was water. And this was my first major lesson. From an Indigenous ethics standpoint, water is a stakeholder in research. This is explained well in the quote here that states, "This is the basic difference between colonial ontology and Indigenous ontology epistemology. Water is life, water is sacred, and water is alive with a spirit. This difference in understanding what water is the basis for how people manage, understand, and exist with water." Now, in my research methods courses for international development, I was introduced to some very basic ideas related to philosophies of knowledge, like positivism, relativism, realism. But this was the first instance of me engaging with the idea of knowledge pluralism, and that there may be more than one way of viewing the world and the way in which knowledge is produced within it. I recall this tree of knowledge figure in an article on Indigenous ethics really resonating with me, and it made me think about a lot about what I knew about water, why I knew it, and what that meant for engineering. So starting to appreciate the idea that knowledge is underpinned by a particular ontology or worldview, it also made me think more about what it means to decolonize your thinking. At times, this deep ponder turned into overwhelm because I went down the rabbit hole, engaging with literature on knowledge politics, knowledge hierarchies, and ideas related to integrating knowledge. But while quite high level, I do think that these ideas are very important for engineers and natural scientists to engage with, especially when working cross-culturally. So I've decided to include another key concept here. And the concept I'd like to share is ontological violence. In the literature, this has been described as the suppression and silencing of Indigenous ways of conceptualizing and experiencing the world, noting that Indigenous worldviews are marginalized through Westernization, which includes any process used to shape things in a Western mode. Now, without getting into any more detail, if some of these philosophical ideas are new to you and you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to also explore similar terms of cognitive imperialism and epistemic injustice in this context. So, as I mentioned earlier, learning about some of this more philosophical stuff was a bit overwhelming for a technically trained engineer like me. So it definitely added to the confusion in terms of where to begin restarting my approach to this research. And it was at this point that I learned my next big lesson. I have a lot to learn, so I need to take some time to listen. There's a great article called "I Spent the First Year Drinking Tea" that talks a lot about the needs for listening during engagement. In that article, the authors say, spending time in Indigenous communities and actively listening and respecting the ideas of Indigenous knowledge holders is essential to establishing relationships based on mutual trust. The challenges and the opportunities that you can have in engaging communities starts with a respectful standpoint, reciprocity, and listening to what communities want. And it was actually this same article that had some practical advice that helped me begin my community engagement with Six Nations. So this transitions into the next main juncture of our journey, relationship building. Now, having read literature on Indigenous community-based research, I still had yet to step foot in an Indigenous community. So who do I try to partner with? For me, I knew I wanted to be there often, so location was a limitation. But at the same time, I had also started hearing about an interesting research project out of Six Nations called Co-Creation of Indigenous Water Quality Tools. And this project was community-led and had a local Indigenous researcher as the principal investigator, none other than Dr. Don Martinhill. So in what seemed as though the stars were aligning, I decided to jump in headfirst by connecting with Don and volunteering on the project. And looking back, this decision led to what I consider as being one of the most important lessons I've learned. Although I didn't fully understand it at the time, volunteering for Don and working on that research project, which is now called Ohneganos, was the best decision I could have made. And what I mean by that is by working for Don on a water project in a home community, I was supporting those who walk two worlds. Dawn, as an esteemed researcher, is a water champion for Six Nations. She knows her community well, of course, and in every personal and professional decision she makes, she's advocating for the Six. She has devoted her career to doing this type of work, so she also deeply understands all the complexities in performing research within this context. So by supporting Dawn's work, I not only formulated a relationship with a mentor, but it also supports the needs and priorities of the community. And I want to also note here that Dawn and other Indigenous researchers often have to perform the double duty of doing their own research while helping others navigate within the community. They also often lend their social capital to other academic collaborators. What all of this effectively means is that those walking two worlds have a great burden they must carry. For me, helping Dawn and Ohneganos was an opportunity to show reciprocity towards Six Nations without it being contingent on anything that I needed. In my view, it was a great way to start the relationship building process. And so there it is. That's how I started working with Ohneganos and Six Nations. Here I am almost 4 years later, still going strong. So the last series of reflections I have to share today are from my time working on this research program. So I'm going to share what I consider to be my most valuable insights in quick succession here by asking common key questions, sort of like an FAQ. So for the last leg of our boat tour, consider this going through the rapids. The first question I'd like to pose, you may ask yourself at some point, is how can I make relationship building feel less transactional? And for me, it's what I just touched on, reciprocity outside of my research. Although reciprocity is an important principle in terms of working with Indigenous communities and research, I found reciprocity solely within the context of your own research makes it feel more transactional and less genuine, especially during the engagement and initial relationship building phase. So this is why volunteering and working for Ohneganos has helped me a lot. The work I do isn't directly for my research, but it supports Six Nations. It demonstrates commitment and it helps build trust. It means your devotion to community isn't contingent on your own work. I often do refer to my experience as sort of being like a community co-op PhD, and it's something that I do recommend for interested folks to consider exploring. Now, next, how can I learn more about the needs of a community? Identifying needs and priorities will often rely on the relationships that you build, but another great way to learn more about communities' interests is by reading publicly available documents that have been published by the community. For instance, Six Nations, they publish a document called the Six Nations Community Plan. And while this may not specifically outline research goals or objectives, it can help indicate general areas of interest or priority, as well as can provide insights on which organizations work in what areas. This can help you learn about potential research partners to reach out to. And it can also really help to try and gather prior research that has been supported by the community in the past, so you can continue to build on something that has already had support. Okay, next, at what stage of the research should I engage community? And there's a mantra for meaningful engagement that goes early, often, and ongoing. And it helps to think about community-led research as being a collaboration and partnership, such that you should be engaging with your partner continuously during each stage of the research cycle. And this also includes building relations prior to developing research, as well as maintaining them after the project has been completed. This, of course, is only a general rule of thumb, and the extent of engagement should be dictated by the preferences of your research partners. A lot of the time, the folks partnering on research have full-time jobs and are busy with other things. So you also want to be sure you're mindful of their time. One opportunity that I had that helped with understanding this was working on Ohneganos research grant proposals that detailed how projects were formulated in partnership with community. If possible, see if you can work with supervisors with experience on this. It can be a great reminder of how to weave community engagement throughout the research, as well as establish important ethical checks and balances. Now, is there a way to facilitate the expectations of project partners? Memorandums of understanding can be a great tool to help with this. MOUs are a non-binding agreement that can help to lay out the research and engagement expectations of all parties. As well, they can often contain details such as what the outputs or deliverables of the project will be, how research data will be handled, and how findings will be reported back to the community. It may also contain important details such as honoraria for partners, what the benefits of the research to community are, and what the next steps are for research beyond this project. And the next tool I want to discuss is, are there ways to get formal project approval from the community? Well, I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous communities, of course, so you'll need to look at the local customs and protocols of the community you'll be working with. But for Six Nations, there's an ethics procedure called the Six Nations Council Research Ethics Committee Protocol that must be followed. Working with Ohneganos, I had the opportunity to complete several of these prior to initiating the one for my own research work, which I found really helpful in terms of becoming familiar with the processes and the expectations. Importantly, for natural scientists and engineers, this is required for all projects, not just ones working directly with humans or animals, which are often the circumstances that require institutional ethics approval. So, and just as a final tip, if a formal ethics board or committee exists at the community you'd like to partner with, I would suggest reaching out to folks to learn more. At Six Nations, the ethics committee personnel have been incredibly helpful. And now our final question for today: how can I incorporate reconciliation in my research? Reconciliation is, of course, a large, complicated topic. But for one, I believe one step in the right direction is by carefully and intentionally following the protocols associated with Indigenous research ethics. Beyond this, there are also resources that you can turn to better understand what it means to integrate reconciliation into the natural sciences and engineering research. For instance, there's an article published in 2020 called "Towards Reconciliation: 10 Calls to Action to Natural Scientists Working in Canada." And related to these calls, Ohneganos has published a book chapter called "Striving Toward Reconciliation Through the Co-Creation of Water Research," where we discuss the opportunities and challenges associated with implementing these calls in practice. And as a final note on this, I do want to add a reminder that as a settler in Canadian, your treaty obligations and commitment to reconciliation persists outside of the research world as well. For me, I found reminding myself of this helps to guide my professional and personal conduct. And in the most simple of terms, being humanizing in the pursuit of becoming an ally. And through your conduct, you can help to foster better relations. Okay, so now that we have braved the rapids, we can safely return to the dock. But before we conclude our time together, I'd like to take a few brief moments to summarize what we found today, starting off with our lessons. There were 4 helpful lessons that we went over today, and these were: water is a stakeholder. I spent the first year drinking tea. In other words, listen, listen, listen. Support those walking 2 worlds, and incorporate reconciliation in research. Now, in terms of helpful concepts that we encountered, they were positionality, ontological violence, reciprocity, including outside of research, and finally, engagement, which is early, often, and ongoing. And lastly, there were 4 helpful tools that we collected, and these were positionality statements, community documents and research, memorandums of understanding, and local community ethics procedures and protocols. All right, so now with our lessons, concepts, and tools summarized, that concludes our trip. But I hope you've learned a few things from today's tour of my experiences related to meaningful engagement and allyship, as it has been a long journey for myself, and I know that I still do have much to learn. But my hopes are with some of these insights, you'll be able to either start your journey a little sooner than mine, or it will help provide you with some additional food for thought for moving forward. I have found that the more you devote your time to thinking about engagement in research, the more you discover the unpleasant history of research in Indigenous communities. And as such, the more it will encourage you to do your very best at following an allied approach. I think we can all agree that the very last thing you would want is for your settler sailboat to be perceived as a pirate ship. So to conclude my presentation here today, I want to say thank you to Dawn, the Ohneganos team, Six Nations community members and partners that I've had the pleasure of working with the past few years. It truly has been an enlightening educational journey. And I want to say thank you to my supervisor and committee at the University of Guelph, as well as McMaster, for your support and guidance along the way. Your patience and understanding have allowed me to learn what I have over the course of my program, and I hope that I'm able to pay it forward. And on that note, I would like to make one last comment on the imagery being depicted here on the homepage. I would like to say, in the spirit of the Kaswentha, the Turo Wampum, I hope this presentation helps to honor this treaty in a good way towards good relations, as I recognize my place on the settler sailboat. And in terms of paying it forward, I hope some of the insights that can be found in the wake of my mistakes, oversights, and lessons learned will be practical and useful to others, as well as myself, as our collective sailboat continues to embark on this journey towards allyship. And on that note, that's it for today. Thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to any questions and feedback.